Let's talk for a minute about writing up your psychological assessment report or intake report. You will want to look at Chapter 7 in your clinical interviewing book before writing this report. Table 7.1 on pages 220 to 223 and pages 234 to 245, including Table 7.3, should be very helpful. Be sure to explain the presenting problem in some detail, talking about the length of time they've been experiencing the problem, how frequently they're having issues, and how severe the issues are. This is the place where you explain why the client is coming now and what they want help with. Also, be sure to include a sentence or two for the mental health and medical history, even if they don't really have any history. It's fine to say, client reported that he's never seen a mental health provider, or client reported that he's in good health. But you have to say something. For developmental history, you have to state whether the mother's pregnancy and the developmental milestones, such as walking and talking, were normal or delayed. Again, it's fine to say everything was normal, but you must state that in the report. The social and family history needs to include a few sentences about the client's growing up years and their relationship with their parents or lack thereof. A few sentences about their current living situation. Are they married? How long? How many children? The ages of the children, etc. A few sentences about the kind of work they do and whether they have any friends or social activities. You can add any other relevant social information here as well, but those things must be included. The case formulation is your opportunity to use your newly forming professional skills to say why you think the client is having this problem, and then you want to give at least 2 or 3 treatment recommendations. In the summary, you want to briefly state all the important points, but never add anything new in the summary. In Chapter 3, Hogan talks about norms and gives a brief review of statistical information that hopefully will be familiar to you from undergrad. When we are evaluating psychological tests, we have to think about the norms. In general, it's difficult to interpret raw scores. If I tell you I made a 40 on my English test, you don't know if that's good or bad. Perhaps the highest grade was 40 and I did great. Or perhaps the highest grade was 100 and I did terrible. Norm scores allow us to compare scores because they include the average in the score. There are 3 major types of norms: percentiles, standard scores, and developmental norms. Let's start with percentile scores. Lay people often get confused between percentile rank and percentage correct. Percentage correct is what we're used to. If I tell you I made an 87 on my midterm, you probably automatically assume that I got 87% of the answers correct. But percentile rank is different. Percentile rank tells you where you scored in relation to the rest of the class or group taking the test. If your child scores at the 90th percentile, that means they scored better than 90% of the group, which is very high. If they scored at the 50th percentile rank, then that means they scored better than half the group, which is still good because they're right at average. Be careful not to get these mixed up. Another type of norm is the standard score. In this case, the raw score is transformed to a Z-score, and then from the Z-score to a T-score, a CEB, College Entrance Examination Board score, like the SAT, or IQ-type score. These are the main types of standard scores that you'll see. There are formulas in your book, but I mainly want you to understand the concept. If your raw score is a 90 on a test, where the mean is 80 and the standard deviation is 10, then you scored 1 standard deviation above the mean. So your Z-score would be +1. If you scored 70 and the mean is 80 and the standard deviation is 10, then you scored 1 standard deviation below the mean. So your Z-score is -1. From that +1 or -1, you can transform the scores again into a T-score, or SAT, or IQ-type score. For instance, if you have a z-score of +1, meaning that you scored 1 standard deviation above the mean, then your t-score would be what? Yes, add 50 plus 10, so it would be 60. What would your SAT score be? Yes, add 500 plus 100, so that it would be 600, which tells anybody that you scored 1 standard deviation above the mean on the SAT. Standard scores make test interpretation much easier, but they're a little difficult to explain to the layperson, and you need to know the mean and standard deviation of the test in order to make the transformation. Developmental norms are used when a trait develops with time. For example, achievement or intelligence are traits that develop with time. It's easy to understand if a person says that somebody is functioning at a 10-year-old level, or if they're at a 4th grade level. We instinctively have an idea of what that means. The problem with developmental norms is that growth stops at some point, so it doesn't really make sense to say someone's intellectual functioning is at a 25 versus 35 versus 45-year-old level. Those are about the same, unless we're talking about physical functioning, where there might be some difference. Also, developmental stages are not evenly spaced. The difference between a 1 and 3-year-old is huge, but the difference between an 11 and 13-year-old is not nearly as much. When professional test developers are working on a standardization program to develop norms for their new test, if they have lots of money, they will try to get a nationally or even internationally representative sample with people of all ages, genders, ethnic groups, SES groups, ability groups, from rural and urban areas, which is great. But sometimes the test developer is somebody like you and me, and they don't have that option. So they just norm the test on the group of people they have access to, people at HBU or people in Houston. The important thing when evaluating norms is to look at the person or people you're administering the test to and compare that person to the standardization group used to create the norms for the test. Is your client similar to or different from the standardization group in gender, age, ethnic group, etc.? Some things don't really vary across age or ethnic group or maybe gender. For instance, measures of anxiety or depression or suicidal thinking may be about the same for a person 25 or 35 or 45 years old. So perhaps subgrouping by age is less important for those tests. One other thing to remember is that often when tests are normed, it's in a research study. Research studies require volunteers. Certain types of people volunteer for things, other people don't. Could this affect the norms? Certainly it could. Also, people in research studies may be more or less motivated to put forth their best effort or to answer honestly than the average person taking the test as an entrance examination or because it's court-ordered or required for a license. Finally, let's remember that we can also have a criterion-referenced interpretation of a test rather than a norm-referenced interpretation. The criterion-referenced interpretation requires that the person's test score be compared to a performance standard or some type of criteria. In other words, the number answered correctly or the number of elements executed correctly. Keep in mind that any one test can be interpreted either way. We could look at the number of questions you got right on the SAT, which would be a criterion-referenced interpretation. Or we can look and see how your score matches up with other people of your age across the country, which is a norm-referenced interpretation.